Okay. Sorry, I did something wrong. So, something. I don't know why it doesn't work. Okay, anyway, we can start. Anyway, I'm afraid I'm not able to put it on YouTube. I'm just recording it. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here, both to the students who are with me here in Pavia and to the people who are online. I'm really happy to chair this seminar today, which has offered me the opportunity to read Raphael's book, which I really like a lot. It is really an extremely inspiring and insightful book, and I really highly recommend reading it, above all to my students. So let me give you some information about how we would like to organize the seminar. And by the way, the seminar is co-organized by the Department of Political and Social Sciences at the University of Pavia and by Remark, the Responsible Management Research Center at the University of Pisa. So first, Raphael will present his book, and then he will be followed by Elisa Giuliani, who will provide some commentary to the book, and then we will have some time for a Q&A. So let me introduce Raphael Kaplinsky. Raphael Kaplinsky is honorary professor at the Science Policy Research Unity at the University of Sussex, and is also emeritus professor at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex and at the Open University. Raphael has published extensively in many different fields, and over the past 4 decades, he has worked with policymakers, the private sector, trade unions, and civil society groups around the world. And since his former retirement at the end of 2014, he has begun working on the green economy and urban regeneration in New Haven and Lewes in Sussex and in Greece. And he's also written the book he's going to present today. So please, Raphael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roberta, and thank you everybody for having me. I'm going to be talking to my book, which was published last year, and I hope I managed to keep you awake, even though it's the daytime. The book opens with the world, we live in perilous times. And in fact, we do live in perilous times. We confront a series of sustainability crises in the economy, in society, governance, and in the environment. In the economy, we had a major meltdown in 2008. We put sticking plaster on that meltdown. The underlying structural problems remain. COVID and now the war in Ukraine, of course, exacerbate the problems, but we shouldn't fool ourselves that there's an easy return to a sustainable growth path, even if the COVID pandemic is over and the war in Ukraine hopefully is resolved soon. In society and governance, the social compact, the sense that people live in a society where they have strong bonds of common interest with their fellow citizens, has deteriorated in most countries, and we live in a world where governments have lost their legitimacy and people often see their fellow citizens as enemies rather than as compatriots. And of course, there's no need to talk about the environmental crisis, which is overwhelming and advancing very rapidly. So the key question is these sustainability crises in the economy, society, governance, and the environment, are they linked? And if they are interlinked, how are they interlinked? Because if they are interlinked, if we are to resolve any of these individual areas of sustainability, we have to work through the way in which they're interconnected so we have a holistic response to a holistic problem. And that's what my book is essentially around, trying to understand these interconnections between the economy, society, and the environment, and in so doing to deliver a response which moves us onto a more sustainable growth path. It does so through using a historical lens. And here I'm indebted, of course, to the work of Carlota Perez, who's with us today, Chris Freeman and others, who've over the years since the late 1970s developed a lens for looking at the performance of society and the economy as it's informed by the experience of the last 300 or 400 years since the onset of the Industrial Revolution. And with this comes the theory of techno-economic paradigms. Socio-technical paradigms, they called, let's not split hairs on nomenclature. Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we've seen 4 long waves, each of about 60 or 70 years, which have taken off slowly, then grown very rapidly, moved into a phase of maturity, began to degrade, and to be supplemented or substituted by a new wave. So we have these waves of economic activity lasting about 60 or 70 years. Each of these waves is driven by what I call a Heartland technology. These Heartland technologies have the capacity to spur productivity growth and to enable producers to reach wider markets. You will remember the words of Adam Smith, that the division of labor, which is the source of productivity of growth, is determined by the extent of the market. Each of these waves, although it is associated with the core Heartland technology, has with it a matching form of social organization, patterns of governance, social norms, and an interaction with the environment. And when the wave is on the upswing, these areas of society, the environment, the economy, interact with each other synergistically and complementary, and the system moves up in a relatively harmonious way. When the system begins to degrade, the complementarity, the positive complementarity and synergy between these dimensions of activity begins to fall away, and the happy golden age of these waves degrades. And the central story of the book is around our current economic problems being around the degradation of the most recent of these waves and the possibility of a new wave, which gives a more constructive, harmonious interaction, synergy between these different dimensions, provides the opportunity for a more sustainable world. But, and the book is centered on this transition is not automatic. And we are faced with the problem of directionality, Mariana Mazzucato's word, to try and impose direction on the new wave as it unfolds, and I'll talk about this as we go along. Now, Heartland technologies are critical to each of these waves. The character of Heartland technologies is that they have 4 attributes. Firstly, they provide major improvements in product performance and productivity improvements in the production of products and services. Secondly, they're associated with declining price. Historically, their price has declined very dramatically, and critically, the expectation of when people allocating investable resources is that their price will continue to decline in the future. They're in unlimited supply, so there are no constraints to their use. And here's the really important point: they have a ubiquitous use across all areas of economic and social activity. And for example, this is one of the reasons why electronics is a Heartland technology in a way that biotechnology is not. And that the 4th Industrial Revolution confuses a series of technologies which have impact across a number of sectors, and conflates that with ICTs, which have use across all dimensions of economy and society. So what are these four waves? The first one after the Industrial Revolution was the development of the factory system, water power substituting for human power, and canals enabling producers to reach markets beyond their immediate locality. Water power had its limits. Production had to be near the source of power, and canals only allowed you to feed markets, which were on waterways. So the second wave was a wave where the technology was steam power, much more efficient than water power, and railroads enabled producers to reach markets beyond the reach of rivers. So the first wave was spanning the 1800s to the 1900s. The second wave, the beginning of the 18th century, then the steam and railroads in the 19th century. And then in the second half of the 19th century, the third wave, which was a combination of electricity, metals, heavy metals, which enabled you to vastly expand the productivity of production, telegraphy and ships, which enabled producers to reach global markets. In 1908, the key development of the fourth wave was the Model T Ford, or Henry Ford. And Henry Ford, as you know, was around product standardization. You could have a Model T Ford in any color you liked as long as it was black. And what that did, that enabled production to be standardized and for economies of scale to be reaped. So scale and standardization were critical to the development of mass production. Special purpose machinery was then brought to bear on standardized processes. Forms of social organization were developed, which were essentially top-down. Henry Ford said he paid his workers to work, not to think. And then through the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, the reaching of markets was driven through automobilization and a carbon intensive technologies, oil being particularly important. World War II was critical to the expansion of mass production. It honed the system and was transformative in the production of military weapons, but after the war that spread through to across a number of economic sectors, including the way in which we organize society, the way in which the welfare state was delivered, and associated with that was the expansion of automobilization, the building of motorways, Italy being a classic case, people moving from city centers to suburbs, mass consumption of single-use goods, individually owned and throwaway products. Now, the 2 decades after the Second World War until the mid-1970s, often referred to by economic historians as the Golden Age, were a period of unparalleled economic growth. And I would say, and not just within the rich countries globally, and I would say also an unparalleled sense of common purpose and social compact. People felt they were living in a system in which everybody or most were gaining. However, as these decades unfolded, the rate of productivity growth began to decline as mass production, the gains of mass production were exhausted. The oil dependency of mass production gave power to oil producers. So in 73 and 79, we had the exercise of monopoly power, and the combination of those two gave us a set of developments which we're beginning to see again in the 2020s of stagflation. Low levels of economic growth with high levels of inflation. So the system had run out of steam, as is true of most of all the previous techno-economic paradigms, and was also associated, and I documented this in the book, with a falling rate of profit. Now, in previous paradigms, in times like this, we would have made the transition to a new paradigm. However, there was an escape route for mass production, which has major implications for the world as a whole and for developing countries and for indeed development studies. The crisis of falling rates of profit was met by the exploitation of cheap labor in the developing countries. And so we had an interruption, as it were, to the maturation of mass production. And the escape valve for the paradigm was the development of globalization, deep globalization, global value chains, and the amazing transformation of China and in surrounding economies. And you all know the story, massive reduction in absolute poverty in China and East Asia, and a prolongation of economic growth throughout the global system. And globalization was seen as being normality and something which would continue without interruption. It didn't, of course. And by 2006 and 2007, the degree of global integration began to fall. If you look at the share of global production occurring in global value chains and global trade occurring in global value chains, it stabilizes and begins to fall after 2008. We have an economic crisis in 2008, where we put sticking plaster on it. Obama appointed the people to solve the crisis in America, who'd been the cause of the crisis in the first place. And the economy was driven by speculation, a massive growth of unequalization. And as the first 2 decades of the 21st century unfolded, an increasing crisis in the social agenda as well. Inequality, collapse of the social compact in the economy, financialization and growing debt, short-termism in the investment horizons, and patterns of unequalization in the social economy, reinforcing the slowdown of the economic system. And no emphasis, of course, it was also a period of a massive expansion in the environmental crisis. So the point which I try to address in the book in some detail, the book is full of empirical information, probably too full of empirical information, is the interaction between the social, the economic, and the environmental domains in this declining phase of mass production. Mass production gave inequality, which promoted and was reinforced by neoliberal policies, which further enhanced inequality and further undermined growth. So the politics of mass production gave you the decline of the economic sustainability. The decline of the economic sustainability further reinforced the decline in the social environment. The decline in the nature of mass production created an environmental crisis. The environmental crisis created migration and reinforced a social crisis, and the environmental crisis increasingly had costs, and those costs helped to slow down economic growth. So the first, as it were, part of the book is really to explore the nature of these slowdowns in each of these realms of economy, society, and the environment, and to show how they were interrelated and how these could be understood in the context of the theory of techno-economic paradigms. We now, as in previous paradigms, are on, we're not on the edge, we're now in the next wave. And this is a wave driven by ICTs. Remember the 4 characteristics of a Heartland technology: massive improvements in productivity and cost reduction, declining price historically and expected, unlimited availability of the technology, and pervasive use across the system. It's an ICT wave, not a 4th industrial revolution as seen by Davos and by the German economic policy, for example. I think it loses its analytical focus. The new paradigm is flexible, it's labor saving, productivity increasing, and gives us a range of new products and services. It's associated with dramatic changes in lifestyles, and critically, it changes the logic between the geographical, as it were, pattern between production and consumption. Mass production was a system in which production and consumption increasingly became separated. You produced in China in order to consume in America. In the UK context, you lived in my area, Brighton or Lewis, and you commuted to London. Production and consumption were increasingly separated in political systems which were top-down, driven by central government. ICTs offers the opportunity to reverse those. We can bring back production, and we are bringing back production and consumption in proximity. And the system of top-down governance, that is where all the decisions are made at the top, where people are told, Henry Ford, I pay people to work and not to think, that social milieu, the idea, lifestyles, the attitudes and values of mass production are now being overthrown. So we have this new wave we're in. It has a dark side. It has weapons, it has surveillance, it has an increasing concentration of power, monopoly power, and of income. But it also offers the possibility for transformative development of a new and more sustainable compact link between the economy, society, and the environment. And so my book then addresses in the last section the question of how do we impart directionality into this new wave? And it offers 5 policies. And I'm going to briefly explain the 5 policies and to say that since writing it, I've got the order wrong. The first policy in the book is to reduce the power of the financial sector as a gambling arena and to reorient the financial sector towards the productive sector, and in particular to the green industrial revolution, smart green revolution. That was my first proposal. My second one was to curb the power of the plutocracy to shape our values. The absurdity of saying, don't give social security to poor people, because if you give them money, poor people won't have the incentive to work hard. However, don't tax rich people, because if you take money away from rich people, you'll reduce their incentive to work harder. And in many parts of the world, this is the established wisdom. Tax against the rich and the productive sector is bad. It reduces the incentive to innovate. Social security for the poor is a bad thing. It reduces the imperative to work. And this has become, this is an example of the extent to which the plutocracy control our political perspectives, our social perspectives, and our value systems. And the idea of Elon Musk owning Twitter sends shivers through my spine. So the first 2 policy agendas are firstly redirecting the financial sector to the productive sector, to the green sector. Secondly, curbing the political power of the plutocracy to determine social and political agendas. The third one, and this is the heart of the directionality, is a smart green New Deal. The green economy and the expansion of the green economy is not a cost. I'm pushing against an open door to this audience, but it offers enormous opportunities for more productive activities. And with that comes also a restatement of what we mean by growth, the madness of economic growth as a form of progress, where creating pollution in GDP figures, you create pollution, all the activities which go into creating pollution are positive contributions to GDP, and then cleaning up the pollution afterwards to the extent that we do that also goes into the GDP calculations, so that our measures of what constitutes progress and the nature of progress need to change as we move to a very rapid pushing out of the green industrial revolution. So that's the third Green New Deal. That's the third policy agenda. The fourth policy agenda is to change the pattern of governance, away from central governance determining everything and pushing it down to the regions in standardized programs, to distributed governance, which is where local action becomes more important and where the locality becomes the determinant, or an increasingly important determinant, of the way in which societies operate. The fifth and final agenda is global development. Now, global development, of course, is important for us just as a moral issue. But global development is also imperative for the working of the global system as a whole. We cannot solve the global problem of pollution without solving the problem, for example, of coal energy in developing countries, or the way in which oceans are regulated, or of the way in which most environmental, the degradation of ecological diversity and whatever. But also, the growth of the developing world provides the consumption which the rich countries require in order to keep their productive sectors going. In the chapter on the economy, and I don't have the time to talk about it in detail, I do attack one part of traditional economic theory, so-called Say's law, which said that it's in the nature of capitalist production that it creates its own consumption. Capitalism has a perennial problem of underconsumption. And so that the role of the developing world as consumers of the goods and services produced by the rich countries is absolutely critical. So that's what we need to do. The question is how we do it, how we achieve directionality. I'm stating the obvious, it's neither the market or the state, it's the way in which the state and the markets interact. And to this audience, I don't need to talk about that in greater detail. Behavioral changes can be achieved through a combination of mandatory regulations, governments saying the following things are required, you cannot pollute the environment in particular ways, but we also need to change our incentive system. So for example, we need to move away from a tax system which taxes labor to a system which taxes material inputs and taxes the assault on the environment. So mandatory regulations are important, changes in the incentive system are important, and critically, and this links to the point about distributed governance, civil society and civil pressure is an important part of that story. So these three instruments of regulation, changes in incentive system, and the greater involvement of civil society are what's required. The response must be at a combination of levels, at the global levels, at the same time as we push governance down from center to the periphery. So we need to enhance the level of governance in some respects to the global level with respect to the environment and taxation. And this requires the building of coalitions across different groups, a stakeholder approach, if you like, to the transformation. Now, of course, we have to avoid being programmatic and saying we have a single response across all countries in all circumstances. These coalitions are contextual and they're dynamic. We may have coalitions, for example, around renewable energy, where groups of firms and get together to deliver particular responses, but those coalitions may dissolve when objectives are met. So just to round up the story, we're in a mess. The mess is around the environment, society, and the economy. They're interconnected. We cannot move to a more sustainable world unless we understand the nature of those interconnections and address them in an integrated way. The key to understanding these interconnections is a historical focus through the lens of techno-economic paradigms. We've seen 4 paradigms which have grown and become exhausted. The crisis we find ourselves in is the crisis of the mass production paradigm. We are now in these deploying stages of the latest wave, the ICT revolution. It has a dark side, it has a really dark side, but it has a positive side as well. And our task, because we're actors as well as analysts, is to participate in this and help to impart directionality. Directionality requires governments to give the lead, requires the corporate sector to respond, it requires cooperation between the corporate sector and government, and critically with the civil society sector as well. The book ends with a phrase, to choose, not to choose is in fact to choose, which is what Sartre said. I've moved beyond Sartre's words, to choose, not to choose is in fact to choose, to say, but in fact to choose, not to act is in fact to choose. We have to take action and to do so with urgency and in an integrated way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rafi, for this very, I mean, you have been able to stay in the time that we have proposed you. And now also the floor is to Elisa. Elisa Giuliani is professor of management at the Department of Economics and Management at the University of Pisa. And Elisa is also the director of Remark, the Center for Responsible Management, who is co-organizing this event. She holds a PhD from SPRU in Science and Technology Policy. So Elisa, the floor is yours.
Okay. So yes, good afternoon, good morning. Thank you, Roberta, for inviting me to discuss this book, and thank you, Rafi, for your presentation. Let me say that I met and I remember Rafi Kaplinsky since I was a second year PhD student at SPRU, and as I attended courses at the Institute of Development Studies. So he may not remember me, of course, but I remember his seminars and lessons and also his provocative ideas. And I remember his capacity sometimes to read phenomena also ahead of time. So it has been a pleasure for me to read this book and to have the opportunity to add, if possible, my own view on this discussion. Of course, this is a very hot, complex issues that is dealt in the book. So there's not an easy, simple solution to the problem that we are facing. Okay, so the first thing that I wanted to say is that I agree, and perhaps I can say what I agree about the book. I agree with the assessment, with the overall assessments of the problems we are facing. I think your voice and the book voice adds up to the existing criticisms to capitalism, if we may want to call it like that. And you talk about mass production system and so on, but it's effectively a criticism to that system. And this criticism has been, we've seen rising and growing among economists and scholars from different disciplines. And it is now clear that capitalism in all its varieties, it's facing a crisis that is no longer acknowledged by critical left or neo-Marxist scholars. It is acknowledged more widely also by mainstream scholars. So clearly this crisis has also become more evident now that we are facing a big war in Europe between Russia and Ukraine, which can be added to the list of disasters of our time. And it's certainly going to exacerbate the already fragile social and environmental context we had before the war and also after the pandemic. So I agree with you and with the book on the problems. Climate crisis, inequality, monopoly power of big corps, as well as social decay are among the big problems. But I would like to spark a little bit of discussion about also the solutions, and especially perhaps be more like nuanced into what I see the good news that you have in your book. So you listed at the end, and you do that very well in the book, a number of things that we need to do. Okay, and I agree with you. We need to green the economy and promote circular economy, stronger, certainly ensure that states have stronger institutions in order to govern the rule, define the rules, and also keep large corporate powers at bay. Also, we need to regulate the financial industry. Progressive taxation is also needed, and so on. So, all this wish list of things that you have in the book and that you mentioned in your talk are really easy to agree on. As far as it's my view, and I see that growing more and more among our profession. So what I think it's important is, and that perhaps we can have a bit of discussion as well after my comment, is that you know, to make this wish list come true, I think we need to really change radically, in a way, the fundamentals of the functioning of the capitalistic system as it is now, despite differences across countries and capitalisms. So and really go at the core of the problem, which is something the book touches upon with many examples, but perhaps can be addressed more in a way more profoundly, or perhaps we can have a discussion on that to further you know, have additional insights from the audience. So I've been working for a number of years on how large companies shape development processes. And so it is clear to me, after so much research and also talking to companies and policymakers, that the fundamental problems here is that the essence of the shareholder value maximization approach, which you mentioned in your book, is still dominant. I mean, it's despite all calls for more benign capitalistic systems, sometimes we call it, or we refer to stakeholder capitalism, the shareholder value maximization model is still highly protected by a number of rigidities. There are many of them. One of them that perhaps would deserve more thinking is the fact that there is a strong apparatus of laws and regulations, as argued by Katharina Pistor in her book, The Code of Capital. Legal system and legal devices are largely nowadays protecting the holders of capital at the expense of the rest. And de facto, this is institutionalizing a pernicious system that is actually creating inequalities. So we have these rigidities. And another one that I see is the fact that we still, and sometimes we forget about this, and we take it for granted perhaps, but we still have a lot of, in political and policy making, and as well as in economic thinking of managers and economic decision makers, we still have a lot of mental models that are, you know, tragically are dealing with complex sustainability issues using a trade-off mentality that applies cost-benefit analysis and win-win logics to address these problems. And this is catastrophic because we know that sustainability dilemmas are not, you know, easily fixable. They're not easily solvable with simple trade-off and approaches and cost-benefit analysis, which prove totally inadequate for the challenges that we are facing. So clearly there's a lot that we need to transform, starting from the approach, the mental model and the cognitive frames of managers and policymakers. And certainly that's a mea culpa we have to do as academic institutions of for many years being trained these people in, especially, I mean, maybe not all of our institutions, but most of us have been trained in this kind of approach. And therefore, this represents a rigidity that, together with others you mentioned in your book, basically make it like, I think they are relevant to the extent that every good news, you mentioned in your book a number of positive developments, which I will briefly mention now. But my fear is that all these positive developments are somehow, or these occasional spells of good news in the right directions, are very much limited by in their capacity to become real transformations for society by all these rigidities that I mentioned. And the good news that you mentioned in your book is that you're pessimistic on the one hand, but you're offering some kind of positive light. Okay, so you offer examples of successful cases where the transformation could start. And so you talk about niche projects, you talk about technologies and the ICT, for instance, applied to developing countries, or carbon sequestration technologies. You talk about, in your book, successful community engagements. But also you mentioned how the oil industry and finance have reacted to pressures by divesting from fossil fuels. You talk about win-win strategies as a way forward, and you talk about mission-oriented policies. So while I see these can be seeds of transformation, at the same time, I have this, based on my research, I have this feeling that all this good news that you also mentioned in your book are in fact simple ways to legitimize a system that is destructive in essence, and that it's this positive news and these positive initiatives and occasional spells of benign activities are just a way to come from the system itself, and just a way to legitimize its perpetuation as it is, without changing the fundamentals and the core, which is what is destructive in the end. So I make a few examples based on my research, okay? So you mentioned finance, and certainly finance is one of the important potential game changers, okay? We have done some work on these universal investors with some colleagues. Universal investors are, these large institutional investors which own assets in most of the worldwide companies, listed companies. And one of them is BlackRock, which is probably well known in this audience. Larry Fink is the CEO of BlackRock, and he has been sending letters to the CEO of the company that are in the portfolio of BlackRock for several years now, saying how it is important for these companies to engage in more sustainable management, take care about human rights and all kinds of sustainability topics, including human rights and so on. You see the numbers here are pretty big. It means they manage portfolio that are quite big, okay? And so there's this expectation that they can make changes. And in fact, this is also reflected by the fact that they are investing more in ESG rated companies. But then if you really go and look at what is in their asset portfolio, okay, so you go and really study and do the homework in a sense, and you look at what is going on in their asset portfolio, and you look at whether they're really divested from fossil fuel and their fossil fuel exposure is diminished. Actually, you don't find this in the data. So we analyzed that between the period 2014 and 2019. So you see an increase in the exposure to fossil fuel in the portfolio of BlackRock, among others, which is, after the Paris Agreement. And so there's a narrative that is being construed that is part of the narrative of the directionality we want the world to go. But then what you observe at the more macro level, it's a completely different direction. But of course, you have to look for it to see it, because anecdotal evidence is actually supporting or providing some support to this narrative. We have another example. I mean, one could make many examples of this, and these are not just examples of one or two firms greenwashing. This is more general. As I see it, it's a more general trend. So if we take, for instance, the Green Deal, the EU Green Deal, one of the ambitions is the promotion of a toxic-free environment. And certainly there has been a lot of discussions about greening chemistry. You talk about, and I appreciate that, you talk about pesticides and fertilizers in your book as a threat, and they indeed are a threat, okay? So there's a lot of movement, policy-wide, high-level policy movement on greening chemistry and reducing pollution derived by the chemical industry. But then if you again go and do your homework and look at what companies are doing in terms of their R&D efforts, if they're really divesting in their innovative efforts from highly toxic chemicals, you actually don't find that. You actually find that companies are progressively and increasingly so investing in highly toxic contaminants, sometimes even toxic contaminants that we know are dangerous for long years. Sometimes they are new toxicants, but their potential for being carcinogenic or mutagenetic and so on, it's very high. And so again, you have a narrative on the one hand, and then you have big trends going in a complete direction. Another example that I don't have hard evidence about, that I'm slightly worried currently is the mission-oriented narratives. I come from a community that has used, that has talked about mission-oriented policies since the 1980s. So clearly, I see where they are going, and I understand the rationale, and I totally agree that we need to tackle grand societal challenges today. But then, how are these communities? I heard these policies operationalized in several countries. Is they take this umbrella fancy term, and then they basically justify with that any kind of policy that is not necessarily transformative. So you have, in Italy, the adoption of green technologies is thought mainly as a win-win logic, with maintaining the competitiveness strategy as a core mission, as a core objective. And we all know that by putting a few solar panels in our houses, our societies would not change at the level that we need them to change. Okay, so clearly these narratives and these directions are construed socially by institutions and by organizations and by elites, or whatever is the organization that is responsible for that. But then we see a directionality in real term that is actually using that legitimacy of, okay, we're going green, we are doing this nicely, to just legitimize a nice face, to get a nice face, and to legitimize the activities that are not radically revised in its core functioning. So, for instance, in the case of the mission-oriented policies, this is taken from my own country, but for instance, I don't see any profound discussion while we think about green transition, about new strategies to make companies accountable for their societal or environmental harms. I don't see any industrial policy that anchors or links subsidies by the government to the performance in social and economic and environmental terms of firms. So these would be things that really would change the direction of where we are going, whereas we're building these big narratives, and then within these narratives, everything is going in very different directions. And actually, in my view, it's, the reflection that I want to leave here is that, if all these good news, these benign activities and initiatives that we see around the world, from niche experiments to super green technologies and so on, are good in themselves, they also can be seen as something that makes they become instrumental for further legitimize the system that is inherently destructive. And so, if that's the case, and then, I would like to open a discussion on that. The bad news is then the core changes that we really need are going to be slowed down by this legitimation. And perhaps we arrive very late to fix the problems that we need to fix, which is what is happening with climate change, because oil companies and governments knew, because scientific evidence was there already in the 70s, that we would have reached this crisis that we have today, and yet they have procrastinated, and they have adopted like a number of symbolic and narrative strategies to legitimize the current system, up to the point that it's too late now, and we don't even realize it's too late now. So clearly there's this risk that I see in sometimes being overly optimistic when we see the green transition or any of this nice jargon that we see around as something that is not just cosmetic, but it's more like is slowing down the real effort, the transformations, like, something that is, it can be even more detrimental in the end than the harm in itself. And of course, this is very contentious, and I'm happy to discuss this further with you and with the audience.
Thank you so much, Elisa. I think now we can, I would say that we can open the floor, both here, if there is anybody who would like to ask question here, or when.
Would you give me 3 minutes to respond to?
Of course, sure. So please.
That was very substantive and eloquent. Somebody must have taught you well when you were in Sussex. And it was very challenging. I'm a South African by origin. I left South Africa as a political refugee in the 60s. And for much of my life, I thought things would never change in South Africa. But they did change. Although it seemed it was never going to happen. I decided to write this book after I was in vacation. I think it was 2017 or 2018. We had Donald Trump, we had Brexit, we had Boris Johnson. No, we didn't have Boris Johnson, but we had the madness of what was happening in the UK. And I thought, look, I can easily descend into pessimism and throw my hands up and say there's nothing we can do, because the truth is the world is very upsetting and challenging out there. Or we can say, look, we have to do something about it. It's a hard struggle, we have to do something about it. So the book I've written is really trying to offer us a path for action, even though we know that the obstacles, the rigidities you talk about, are very substantial indeed. There are signs of progress. I think the extraordinary dramatic rollout of renewable energy technologies is really, it shows that there is progressive dynamism in the system somewhere, and that change can be very rapid and in constructive ways. Where I find most troubling what you've said is this point about politics. And the overwhelming power, as I've said, I changed the ordering of what needs to be done, the overwhelming power of the plutocracy. And I guess I feel we need a big crash. That is, to shake the system requires a big crash, which will, and Ukraine may precipitate it. There's a sense in which Ukraine is part of the decline of mass production, incidentally. The economic system, the high levels of debt in the world, sovereign debt as well also as private debt and corporate debt, suggests that the power of the financial sector will be eroded, will have to be eroded by some very big financial crisis. So I'm sorry, I hope this makes sense. I take all of your points, but we must not fall, I believe, we must not fall into acute pessimism, throw up our hands and say there's nothing we can do. Yes, the agenda I've laid out is challenging, and sometimes it's hard to see a route through it, but I guess it felt that way in the transition during the 1920s and the 1930s. Who would have thought in the depths of the Great Depression in the 1930s that there would be a path out of that, or that out of the calamitous consequence of the Second World War, that there would be such a substantive global spread of an improvement in living standards. So, we're in this together, right? It's not you or me. We're trying to make sense of what we can conceivably do in a world of substantial obstacles. And the single most important thing we can do is not to give up.
Yeah, I agree on that. I did not want to say anything about the big crisis because I didn't want to go there, but I think there's a point there.
Elisa, can we just, there is a question from the audience, and then Carlotta Perez, she would like to intervene. So I read the question, Rafi, maybe if you can just maybe then react to both. So Axel Giroche is asking two questions. The first one is, in the previous changes phases, what were the factors that helped, hindered transition and progress? And then she's asking, you point to the need to integrate civil society more in the distributed governance. How can this be achieved? And then Carlotta, if you would like to just to open your microphone and you can make your intervention.
Roberta, just Carlotta, before you start, Roberta, I'm happy to not to have to respond to every question. So why don't we just have a discussion across the group without me having to respond frequently?
No, of course. I mean, it's just that I read you the question, and then you can react. And of course, we will probably not have the time to answer every question.
As it happens, Carlotta's the perfect person to answer one of those questions.
Okay, but anyway, I mean, we are happy to listen to Carlotta. Hello.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. I think Rafi's book is really a fantastic contribution. And I agree that all the, say, sort of pessimistic views of Elisa are shared. by Raphael and myself. We're both trying to open a path out of this mess. And the thing is that you don't just want it, you don't just think how bad things are and what would be the nicest way to do it, but we're actually trying to see what has happened in previous conditions and previous similar situations. As Raphael just mentioned, in the 1930s, there were many voices saying capitalism has to end. Capitalism is unbearable. And of course, you had the Soviet Union, which was a very new country that was trying desperately to show a different way. And people were following that. And other people were following fascism, also criticizing, especially in Germany, the Weimar Republic and everything else that was harming people, because it so happens that with every technological revolution, we go through periods of horror. You know, I've been trying to count the number of books about ethical capitalism, the future of capitalism, how do we change capitalism, journals, books, also people are trying to find ways. So the best way perhaps to look at this situation that we all recognize as unbearable is to wonder, Elisa seems to suggest that the only way is to get rid of capitalism. The problem is that then we have to find out how we can get rid of capitalism. That's one thing. The other is, do we understand capitalism and does it have any chance of making things better? Well, first of all, we look back to the golden ages. So we see there have been some golden ages, and each of the golden ages has lifted a new layer of population up. It's a very unfair system, but there is something very peculiar about capitalism or about market economies. And that is that it never responds. A market economy does not respond to possible problems in the future or to how things are more or less getting not so good. It responds to crashes, to problems, to revolts, to revolutions, to populist leaders getting rid of the middle ground. It responds to, possibly in terms of climate change, we probably need New York being flooded or some really major catastrophe that will convince capitalism that it's got to act. And when it does act, it acts very quickly. But of course, this time we have a big problem, which is that climate change is not reversible. Poverty is reversible. Inequality is reversible. Climate change is not. So we are in a very special situation. And I'm afraid we can't wait for some lovely socialism to come along. I mean, somehow we've got to find real solutions. And those real solutions, we have to fight for those. If we fight for some imaginary dream that's not possible, we help capitalism continue doing the horrible things it's doing. If we all get together and look at the things that have to be changed, which are climate change, finance, the 5 things that Raphael says, which I think are precisely the 5 roots. So that's the question. Do we try to turn the whole system upside down because it's awful, which it is, or do we try to get the best of capitalism now when they are beginning to worry that there are too many voices going against even the free market, you know, the neoliberal economics, it's getting hit. You know, there are all sorts of things that are like signals of these changes. We need to push them. But if we have the best people, the most concerned people pulling in a direction which is very unlikely to happen, and then a minority in the center sort of trying to push in a direction that's possible, that's viable, we might not get there. And that worries me a lot.
Thank you, Carlotta. May I answer, or may I say something, Roberta, or you have a queue of people?
Okay, no, please go ahead.
No, I mean, I take the point. I mean, I didn't mean to sound that I was wishing to discard capitalism per se. If I have to think about what I would, in my area of expertise and in my area of research, what my suggestion would be for changing some of the functioning of core elements of capitalism that could make it more just in the way it works. I would certainly start with reforming corporate governance and with having industrial policies where governments provide subsidies and incentives to firms only provided they don't distribute dividends for a number of years, or they have social and environmental behaviors measured in ways that are defined by the governments and not by private financial companies. And so on. So I think that there is a lot we can do there, and I'm actually working in this direction together with some Italian institutions to promote these kind of policies. It's very hard, of course, because there are vested interests in the industry that doesn't work at all these issues to be touched, including all the policies that have to do with business and human rights and the human rights and environmental due diligence. I think all this is necessary because it forces companies to think about how they redistribute their value that they generate, and certainly tackling tax avoidance. I mean, all these distributive issues that have to do with how wealth, economic value is generated at the firm level and how it is distributed. This could be tackled, not through like very impossible policies. I think that's feasible if there is political will, and we might go in that direction. So I think we can reform, but we need to really go and deconstruct piece by piece some of the fundamental roots that instead so far characterize most capitalism, most form of capitalism. The second point is that I think we can do, and I'm certainly doing this, and I think most of you are as well, is training. So education, we are, I'm training the future managers as to see, away from shareholder value maximization through a number of examples. So examples are good because they help them to move beyond the conventional wisdom. So these two directions are something that we do, and I'm certainly active in doing. But I'm like whereas I'm doing this, and I take I put a lot of effort in that. At the same time, I have this high question level. So I'm not saying because I have this question, this idea that all these nice things will legitimize a system that is going towards crashing, okay, and then we need a big crisis to reform it. Although I have doubts that this might be the case, but that doesn't diminish my commitment to fixing things. But I think this ambivalent, these two levels, the relationship between these two levels is not easy. And I was wondering what the other things think about it.
Can I just answer one sentence? You are doing what we need to do to get, when you say two levels, that's exactly it. What Rafe is doing, what I'm doing is giving the general direction. What you are doing is it's getting the specific way of getting finance out of the way and doing the rest. So that's great, Elisa. I'm very happy to learn that.
Okay, can I just make an observation, which is maybe putting the attention to another angle, another perspective, because I think in your book, Refi, you state at the beginning that your focus is on advanced countries, but I think that of course, a lot of the actions that you are envisaging are going to have a large potential impact on latecomer countries. So just to make an example, when you say when you present the need of changing lifestyle, so for instance moving from fast fashion and also moving manufacturing back to advanced country. So this is of course going to have an impact on latecomer countries. And so for instance, the reduction of fast fashion is going to have impact on the clothing industry in Bangladesh. We know about all the social and environmental problems link with this kind of production in Bangladesh. But if we just move everything back to advanced countries, Bangladesh will be left with nothing. And so I think, and also, I mean, you in your book, you are quite critical with global value chains. And I would say that, yes, it's true that global value chains have been, after a huge growth, the amount of trade has stabilized, but it doesn't seem to be so much declining. So it's more a kind of stabilization, probably after a very rapid growth. So, I mean, I think nowadays it's difficult to think about how is going to be globalized the world in the next I mean, in the next few years, because I mean, what is happening from the political point of view is really complicated. The framework, but I think somehow, I mean, probably you will need another book to tackle developing countries, because otherwise, I mean, you lose really an important part of the story. And I know that you are very sensible to this particular part of the story.
Can I come back on this one just briefly, Roberta? I won't be long.
Yeah.
Your last point is absolutely right. The agenda was too big to also look at developing countries. But with Erika Kramer-Mbula, I've written a piece for Research Policy, which has been published, the celebration of Chris Freeman's centenary, which begins to think through the implications for developing countries of this. And just briefly, 4 points. Firstly, outside of agriculture, in Asia, Latin America, and Africa, more than 2/3 of the population earn their livelihoods in the informal sector. Outside of agriculture, more than 2/3 of the population earn their livelihoods outside of the formal sector. So the rolling out of mass production, which is really a capital-intensive, highly centralized form of production, doesn't work anyway in the developing countries. And the possibilities for leapfrogging, for moving forward and circumventing the difficulties of mass production, lend themselves to action in developing countries in particular ways. And with Erika, we addressed 4 issues. Firstly, the green economy is an efficient and overwhelming economic and social opportunities in developing countries, as in rich countries. Okay? Secondly, the dynamism of the informal sector, and here, Roberta, you come into the story. We've quoted your work. The informal sector dynamism, because it's small, requires some form of collective efficiency. And in the old days, the informal sector was a survivalist sector. Now you have this massive informalization of livelihoods in developing countries with people with high levels of education. There are more than 10,000 people in Kenya in the informal sector writing essays for students in the rich countries to submit to their lecturers as their own work. That's not the informal sector of the past. So we need to find some way of harnessing this entrepreneurial dynamism, the growing levels of skill development in the mass of the population which is currently excluded. Secondly, ICTs have enormous potential, not just in the green economy, but the thing which strikes me is the massive opportunities which ICTs offer for agriculture in the informal sector, and for reaching the needs of distant and poor people. And then the last one, which relates to a point you've made, Roberta, which we address, is when we move from the global value chains to regional value chains, when we move from south-north trade to south-south trade, whole new agendas are opened up for a different form of geographical location, away from China to America, but more from intra-African trade. And the implications for this, I don't have time to talk about it. The nature of these value chains in regional trade is very different to the nature of the value chains and global value chains. So forgive me, I'm sorry, I've been a long response to an important point, but we need to now start unpicking what opportunities this opens for directionality in developing countries, and not to underestimate these opportunities.
Thanks. I think there is a question from Valentina De Marchi. Valentina?
Hi, everyone, and thanks for the question. I was having a question that, yeah, I will be very short, because I would also want to learn the answer to Excel questions, which I think was very interesting. So, well, first, thanks for the enthusiasm. And then I was also thinking, relating with what Elisa said. So not really a question, but a comment. Like 10 years ago, as management scholars, we had to convince firms that indeed it was worthy to be sustainable. Now everyone is aware about that. The point is that very often they're doing things that are not really effective. So we see a lot of means as ends divide, and not necessarily just for greenwashing things, but even for genuine ignorance about what is effective in terms of environmental reduction of impacts. So yeah, just to relate to that and add maybe a layer, because sometimes we just think that is firms are not willing to, but sometimes they're truly not aware of. And so more and more I get into more relating to what Elisa said, that doing something is not necessarily better than doing nothing. And so, yeah, I think this is also part of the discussion we may want to add, because indeed we see many companies doing things. But for example, if we look at how many trees will be needed to be planted to compensate all CO2 emissions as they're written into the reports of firms, we will need the moon to plant them all. Okay, so that's sometimes what they want to do is not necessarily something that is either feasible, either doable. So just wanted to add maybe some of complexity layers to what was discussed. But again, stopping here, because I would love to keep learning and listening to the very interesting answers. Thank you.
We have here a brave student who would like to ask a question. So please, your name first.
Hi, I'm George, and I think less than a question is a comment, a bit of comment. I want to start from Edith's famous phrase in which she says that we live in the best of all possible worlds, but maybe it's not perfect.
Sorry, they say they don't hear well. So maybe just try to speak here.
Oh, okay.
Maybe directly to the computer, please.
Can you listen to me?
Do you hear now?
Yep.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, okay. Hi, teacher. No, I'm referring to what you have said before, speaking about in these false ways in which we live, by the point of view of the development of the capitalism. And we live in the era of, if it's possible to say, of the Anthropocene, in which the human being is in the center of this development. Maybe I want to say we live in the best of the possible worlds in the universe that exists, and maybe this world is not perfect, but is simply the least worlds. I want to correlate it with the ecological transition and the aspect of irreversibility, because I belong to the youngest generation, and maybe we find ourselves in a difficult way of to sustain our health in which we live. And maybe sometimes I want to ask to the old generations, what are the keys to guide ourselves in the next 15 years in these worlds? Maybe, okay, there are different ways of conducting, by the point of view of economical aspects, the way to live and to guide. Maybe I want, if it is possible, by your point of view, a personal opinion about to don't come to irreversibility. how can we come to it?
Okay. Let me see if there is a more. No, I don't think there are more questions at the moment. So, I mean, if you maybe Rafi, and then I don't know if Elisa, she would like to add something, if you want to conclude and, I mean, give some answer to a question. So, please.
With respect to Elisa and Valentina, I don't believe that we're in opposition. We're sharing the constraint which confront us, and we're saying it's really hard. It's really hard. And I understand that. Sometimes one makes progress at the micro level, and the macro impact is not substantial. One of the advisor to the British government, the chief scientific advisor many years ago, said on the environment, if everybody only does a little bit, we will only achieve a little. So we need these big changes as well, but the big changes have to be integrated with the small changes. And we have the capacity, I believe, as teachers and as students to affect both those dimensions. On the question of irreversibility, you're right. I mean, the environmental problem is overwhelming and substantial. And I wish I could click a finger and say there's a single solution which will solve the problem. For example, today there was a report on one of the technical fixes for global warming, which is madness, is to reflect back the sunlight by putting particles in the atmosphere, which will actually increase and change the distribution of malaria around the world. And so there are things which happen with irreversibility, which are, there's very little we can do about it, but we have to keep up the struggle and to make the point, to amplify a point the student makes, which is the world we are leaving behind our generation and the challenges which is there for you. A famous artist said to be Matisse, once said, if I knew what the picture looked like, why would I bother to paint it? So it's what unfolds in the future is unknowable at this stage. The steps that are required in the future, the concrete steps which will help us sew together this more sustainable world, some will just unfold as we go along. But the more we can actually bring together progressive forces to work together as coalitions, as stakeholders working at this problem, the more likely we will be to have an impact. But, and that's key to my book, we have to understand the interrelationship between the environment, society, and the economy, how they co-evolve and how they feed into each other. And we have to see this problem not just as a technical problem, it's also a political problem, and in many respects, it's primarily a political problem with technical solutions rather than the other way around.
Elisa?
Perhaps I can add another dimension to another angle to the irreversibility issue. So normally we think of irreversibility in environmental terms, but actually you can see reversibility also in terms of human rights. So for instance, your right to health or your right to life. Once if you take it in connection with companies, once a company has contaminated an environment, the environment or your community, its chances are that you get cancer and you die, and so on. So this is very much irreversible, okay? And we come from a period in which we would think, okay, companies contribute to economic growth strengthens institutions, there will be better hospital, better doctors, more education, and so on. And so people will get less sick or will get easier, it will be easier to fix the harm, okay? They would go in better hospital and so on. Actually, we realize that we have a huge emergency on premature deaths in contaminated areas, so that this is pretty much an effect of an irreversible effect. So at the firm level, how do you deal with that? And this is where I work. Essentially, this discussion that we are having also at the EU level about having this human rights due diligence is precisely to make companies have plans to avoid these damages in the first place, rather than leave them like have these harms. Sometimes they are even allowed by the law. In other cases, they are not allowed by the law, but yet nonetheless, as we know, that these things happen even in the most regulated countries, like including Italy. And so now we are saying, well, no, I mean, you have to prevent harm from occurring. You have to have a plan to avoid these harms from, these harmful impacts. And if you cannot avoid the harmful impact, then you have to converse and establish a relationship with the community that is going to be affected, and find ways to, find a common ground, find ways to compensate, agree on a compensatory, even extrajudicially. Okay, so it's a completely different approach to business as the one we have been used so far, and it's changing. And I see what Valentina is saying and what the others are saying. Of course, I see these signals of change. Okay, very slow. It's very slow. The pace at which I see this happening, and this is, but still, this is one way to deal with the reversibility at the micro level, and where some companies are going. And in principle, the EU directive on environmental and human rights due diligence should be going.
Thanks, thank you. Yeah, I think the problem is really the timing, no? Because I mean, we see changes, but then I mean, we would like to see some result of these changes or realization of the changes in our own life, not in the life of our children or our grandchildren, maybe. So I don't know if there is any more question, reactions. If Rafi, you would like to add something, otherwise we could just close.
Two things very briefly. Firstly,
please.
The unmet issue. In the book, I discuss the question of lifestyles, the nature of consumption, how we consume. And that then raises the question of what we mean by economic growth. So I think you're in Italy, right? Club of Rome. This is the 50th anniversary of the Club of Rome. The unmet discussion now is, are we talking about degrowth, no growth, or different growth in the rich countries? And I think that's a really important point for discussion. There are really interesting points of view both ways on that, and I encourage people to think about that. The second one is, I don't want to be a Pollyanna and say that the world will be fine and everything's fine, but let's not underestimate the degree and signs of progress. Who would have thought 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that renewable energy would become the cheapest form of energy? Inconceivable. The war in Ukraine is tragic in many respects, but it's going to speed up the energy transformation in ways which we would never have expected. So the problem's not going to solve itself, okay? And as Elisa points out, the rigidities are substantial and may often appear to be overwhelming. But there are signs of progress. There are signs of progress, and we need to build on and harness those signs of progress. Otherwise, let's just give it all up, take a pill, and go to sleep. We can't do that. We have to continue as if it would work.
Yeah, no, if I can just add two very small things, I fully agree with you, and I think that, for instance, in terms of lifestyle changes, this is something on which, at individual level, there is a lot of possibility of really making an impact. And I think that we are really already making an impact, because these things are changing really and are increasingly changing. And the second point is about renewable energies. And it's just something I was reading the other day. I mean, and it's an important signal. The US is starting to invest in research in renewable energies, which is quite a revolution, because I mean, in the Department of Energy, they have just opened up a department for innovation in renewable energies. And the Department for Energy in the US has never invested in renewable energies, because the US has never been really interested in this field. So I think that these are important changes, and somehow, I mean, I think that these are the result of what is happening, for instance, in these days with the war and everything. I mean, of course, this is the decision of the US is not really driven by the Ukrainian, because it was before, but I think this is an important signal, to me at least. Okay, so thank you very much to everybody. Thank you, Rafi. It has been great. I think it has been also a wonderful opportunity for our students. And thank you, everybody. Thank you, Elisa.
Thank you for inviting. Thank you, Rafi, for the presentation and the book.
Thank you, Elisa. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, and okay, so I hope we will have opportunity to see each other in presence soon.
Okay, and thanks to Carlotta. The book is built around Carlotta's views.
Thank you, Carlotta. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Carlotta. I don't know if she's.
Bye.
Bye.
Have a nice afternoon. Bye. Thank you.